Hi, Ron Gold again. I'm back in the wine cellar, and this, just as a reminder, is at Three Tree Hill Lodge, and it is Three Tree Hill who are sponsoring this series of videos. Last week, we left General Buller, leaving South Africa after the Transvaal War of Independence, leaving it relieved that he did not have to get involved in a war against the Boers. When he returns to the UK, he is presented to the Queen, who took an immediate liking to him, and the liking was reciprocated. He also became quite cozy with the Prince of Wales, but that relationship would eventually break down to Buller's detriment, for in 1901 the Prince of Wales would become the new king, and his antipathy towards Buller will contribute eventually to his fall from grace. Buller at this point really is going into more administrative functions. He will be promoted into general officer rank, and as a junior general, if you like, a major general, he will involve himself in a number of adventures in the Sudan, where he distinguishes himself. However, in the Sudan again, at Khartoum, General Sir Charles Gordon will be trapped there, and eventually Khartoum will be overrun by the Mahdi's forces, and Gordon and his troops and civilians slaughtered. Buller is part of the relief force, and frankly, the administration and conduct of that force was extremely poor. It is not well generaled, and at one point Buller finds himself in command of a brigade. Largest number of men he probably had commanded up to that point, is forced with taking a decision as to whether to advance on Matemna or not, and he decided not to. He fell back on Abu Clair, I should say, and he will become criticized quite harshly for that decision. Whether the fault was Buller's or whether it was his critics doesn't really make too much difference. He will go back into the UK. He will spend nearly 10 unbroken years at Horse Guards, which is at head office. And during that time, Buller will distinguish himself as one of the reformers in the British Army. The British Army at the time of the Battle of Majuba was pretty much 65 years out of date. And Majuba, despite the humiliation, will do the British an enormous favor, for it will trigger a massive reform drive. And the reforms are led by the Secretary for War, Hugh Childers, but in particular, Wolseley and Buller. And Buller will redesign the entire supply system of the army. It is an incredible job. He does it in 13 months, which is remarkable. He becomes the first quartermaster general. And although his political enemies will try and dismantle that structure later, they had to eventually admit they couldn't. And to a large extent, it still exists in the British Army today. Buller, however, unfortunately is abrasive, and he will start to alienate groups of men within the military structure. He does serve for a time as a special administrator in Ireland, and he very quickly comes out in the favor of Irish peasants who were being badly treated by absentee landlords, and he will leave Ireland having obtained the affection of the locals. But there are pluses and minuses here. He also managed to irritate hugely absentee landlords, wealthy people back in England, and who have long memories. And so once again, Buller, I think his enemies are starting to outweigh his friends. And one needs to be careful, because some of those enemies will rise to fairly high positions. He was earmarked to take over as Commander-in-Chief. The position of Commander-in-Chief had been held by the Duke of Cambridge for many, many years, and it was decided that Buller would be the right man to take over. But then when the British government changes in 1895-96, and the Conservative government of Lord Salisbury comes in, the political winds shifted against Buller, and his friend and mentor, Garnet Wolseley, becomes Commander-in-Chief. Buller becomes a full general at Aldershot. And the general at Aldershot is pretty much the go-to man. Today, if Her Majesty needs military intervention anywhere in the world, that's who you speak to. And so with the war clouds beginning to gather here in South Africa, the Secretary for War, Lord Lansdowne, summons Buller and essentially said that if there was to be a war in South Africa, he, Buller, would command the army. This, of course, should have been the pinnacle of his career. Very few British generals would get the opportunity to command an army in a foreign field. There were very few wars going around. But Buller, rather surprisingly, says he'd rather not. Can he not rather go out as Chief of Staff? Let General Wolseley take command, or General Wood. What we're seeing here is a man who's becoming less confident of his ability. The reality of Buller is that he's a fighting soldier. Buller, in days gone by, had thrived on the dust and clamour of battle, the smell of gunpowder, the cut and thrust. He'd go off with a group of men to drive the enemy off a hill, come back all sweaty and happy, and what do I do tomorrow? But the trouble is that generals don't do that. Generals need to be politicians. Generals need to be big picture men. And Buller, in letters to his brother, would admit quite freely that that wasn't really what he was about. From Aldershot, as the war clouds gathered, he issued advisories to British officers here in this country, in Natal. And he said to them, do not put any of your troops north of the Tugela River. It is a salient, meaning a potential trap. Buller, remember, had fought with Boers. He knew how quickly they could move across the ground. He knew how easily British troops could get cut off. But in the end, politics will decide this, not military wisdom. And when the war breaks out, nearly 15,000 British troops were stationed north of the Tugela. What will happen, of course, is that the Boers will cut them off. And by the time Buller and the Army Corps arrive here, there's a terrible mess, which need never have happened if they'd listened to him. And Buller now, this unhappy, uncertain general, is left with the task of undoing the mess. And this will really begin for Buller a period of 6 to 8 weeks, which will destroy his career. And to me, there's a sadness. There's a man who had a 40-year exemplary career, and in 8 weeks, it will be shattered. He will destroy it himself. He will have no one to blame. But nonetheless, again, I find it a pity. But if we look at his time here in South Africa, he was loved by the men. The men knew that he had a common touch. The men knew that Buller, for all his liking of fine food and good wine, would not let a morsel past his lips until he'd ridden round to all the regimental mess wagons to make certain they were operating and the men were being fed. And they knew that. They knew he took care of them. Of all the columns that operated, the British columns that operated in South Africa, and remember that during this war, 2 out of 3 British casualties would be disease deaths. Buller's column had fewer disease deaths than the others, because Buller cared for his people, and they knew that. When Buller returns in October 1900 to the UK, he is met with, they say, the largest crowds ever to meet a returning general. The train is decked with bunting. He's met at the station at Aldershot. The fire brigade parade him back to Aldershot, and there is it's a day in November, I think it was the 10th of November, becomes known as Buller Day. He's restored to his command at Aldershot, but unfortunately the enemies were starting to erode his position, to sort of white ant him. A newspaper man, Leopold Amery, who had been out in South Africa as a reporter for the Times, had become the editor. Amery hated Buller, and Amery begins a campaign of criticism of Buller in the newspaper. And that campaign picks up speed. By this time, the Secretary for War, Lord Lansdowne, who hated Buller anyway, has been replaced by someone who hated him even more. And this is Broderick. And Broderick and Field Marshal Lord Roberts and the new king had it in for Buller. And it was just a matter of time. Buller eventually, frustrated beyond belief, made a bad tactical blunder. And he stood up and made a public speech defending himself against criticism that he was being subjected to in the newspapers, and that gave his enemies the gap they needed. He shouldn't have done that. And he's put on half pay. He's effectively fired. And he returns to Downs, where he will live out the rest of his days as the squire, much beloved by the locals, who gave him a hero's welcome. And they make an enormous statue of him. Now, statues are normally made after a person's dead. This one wasn't. Buller unveiled it himself. And in the cathedral at Exeter, there's a Buller arch, and so he will live out his remaining days in the bosom of his family and his friends. He dies in 1908. He dies of pancreatic cancer, and he's buried in the small cemetery in Crediton, but his funeral was enormous, and common soldiers came for miles, some of them walking for miles. There's a story of a newspaper man traveling down to Crediton for the funeral in a train compartment with several soldiers, and he was listening to their stories of the war. And one man told him how two of his brothers had died during the war. Then he started talking about Buller, and only then did he begin to weep. And that was it chokes me up sometimes thinking about it, but that was the esteem that Buller was held in. So next time you read about the negative things of Buller, yes, they're true, but there is another part. And that's the end. And our next little episode will be the Boer general who takes over from General Piet Joubert, and that'll be Louis Botha.